Hi everyone, Mrs. Below here. In this video, I'm going to be going over scientific method. So again, you could look up scientific method on the internet and you can find a wide variation of this method. But generally speaking, scientific method, whenever you look it up, will start with a very similar step, and that is making an observation or asking a question, okay? You notice something using your senses. You see something, you smell something, hear something, okay? This is usually the first step whenever you look up any version of scientific method. As far as, the rest of the steps, there might be slightly different variations depending on what, maybe you would find on the internet, but generally these are the steps. So this can also include maybe making measurements or collecting data as well. So you're just gathering information, you're noticing something, and typically you're generating some type of a question about it. There are two types of data. The first is qualitative, and this is descriptive data. So this is data that describes things. I always think of this type of data, I always remember qual, and I think quality. So like color, smell, texture, etc. Things that maybe you're getting with your senses that needs to be described in words. Sometimes we'll collect this data in this class, but most of the time in this class, we are going to be collecting qualitative data, which is numerical, basically numbers. And I always remember qual, I think quantity. I think how much of something. And again, this can be a measurement in those metric units that we've been talking about. So basically the first step is you make an observation, you ask a question. Maybe you are collecting some data and you have some questions about that data now. Maybe the data was qualitative, you smelled something, you noticed a color of something, or maybe it was quantitative. Maybe you did collect some numerical data. The next step, again, typically will be to form a hypothesis. So hypothesis is a prediction that is testable. Most of the time you'll see it written in that if-then format. So if I do this, then this will happen. It doesn't have to be in that format, but it usually is. And basically we're trying to explain for something, okay? We're trying to answer that question that we came up with. Now we're like, okay, we have this question. Okay, now how am I going to answer that question? And then we're going to test it to see if our hypothesis is supported or not. When it comes to an experiment, okay, we have our hypothesis. Now we have to carry out an experiment. So we have to test to see if our hypothesis will be supported, okay? So the experiment is going to test to see if supported or rejected. So in our experiment, we have a couple different variables that we have to keep in mind: independent, dependent, and controlled. So the independent variable, this is what you are manipulating or what you are testing. So it's the thing that you are trying to test in your experiment. It is the variable that's going to be manipulated. Versus, as the name suggests, dependent, it's going to depend on, hopefully, depend on your independent variable. And this is often what is measured. after each independent variable change. So you're manipulating, it's the independent variable, it's the factor that you're testing, and then hopefully your dependent variable is responding to that and is depending on the independent variable. Controlled variables, these are often, sometimes these can be really hard to actually control. They're basically other factors that are kept constant throughout the experiment. Sorry, that's my dog. Freckles, stop. Sorry, had to pause there. My dog was barking at something. So anyway, the controlled variable is, or variables, sometimes it could be multiple, are things that are kept constant throughout the experiment. You want to make sure that the only thing affecting your independent variable, or the only variable impacting your dependent variable, is the independent variable and not anything else. So especially in this class, like we'll keep maybe temperature or volume or mass or something that we're measuring. We might keep one of those variables the same throughout the experiment. All right, I want to go over some practice problems here using a graph. Okay, so let's say that maybe you had a question about how fertilizer impacts plants' growth, okay? And you want to test that out. You come up with this experiment here, okay? So we've already done the hypothesis, and now we're trying to carry out an experiment. So let's say that we think the higher percentage of phosphorus and fertilizer that we use, the more plant growth there will be, okay? So here I have a graph. On this side we have time in days, and on this side we have growth. Notice that it is in centimeters, which is metric. And there's also a title for this graph, plant growth versus time. So I can see here that there were a couple different groups that were being tested. I know I didn't add it on here, but you can also have an experimental group and a control group. So the experimental group is the one that would get the independent variable, and then the control group, they would not get the independent variable. So they're the control in the experiment. So in this experiment here, the no fertilizer, this was probably the control group. And then the experimental groups, we had 3 different percentages of phosphorus in the fertilizer. And then we tracked the plant's growth over, looks like 20 days. So what was the independent variable in this experiment? What is being tested? Well, I can see here that it must be the percent of the phosphorus. I'm going to write P because that's phosphorus on the periodic table in the fertilizer. Because that's the thing that we're testing. That's the thing that I can see that's different in these 3 cases. And we're hoping that that independent variable, what we're testing, what we're measuring, the fertilizer, is impacting the dependent variable. Remember, the dependent variable is what you measure. So in this case, to see if that fertilizer is effective, we're measuring the growth of the plant in centimeters. As far as variables that were most likely controlled in this experiment, there's a lot that could be listed. But since we're talking about a plant here, I would imagine that the sunlight was probably kept the same, because you don't want like one plant getting more sunlight and one plant getting less, because then that could skew your results. Plants also need water, so probably the water. Maybe also just the other components in the soil besides the fertilizer. Maybe the type of, so the plant's type. It's not like we're using different plants in this experiment. The list can go on and on. So essentially, your experimental group was the plants that were getting the different amounts of phosphorus in the fertilizer. The control group would have been the plant that got no fertilizer. The independent variable, what we're testing, is the percent of the phosphorus in the fertilizer. And then the dependent, which we're measuring, is the plant growth. And then hopefully all of these things were kept the same throughout the experiment. And it looks like at the end of this experiment, which we're going to talk about on the next slide here, we can draw some conclusions. So I'm going to go ahead and answer this question here. So what can you conclude about the experiment? So it looks like as the percent of the phosphorus increased, okay, so when we went from 10 to 25 to 50, we are seeing an increase in that plant growth. However, it looks like it doesn't matter. I'm going to say up until 25%. It looks like there's no difference between 25 and 50%. So it looks like 25% phosphorus in this fertilizer is kind of like our cap, okay? That's the most percent that we could use that's going to increase the plant's growth, because clearly if we go above that, it's not going to increase the growth in any way. What qualitative data was collective? So remember, quantitative, is quantity. So again, this has to deal with numbers. And it looks like we measured the height in centimeters, so that would be data. And then you can also say days as well. That's these variables right here. And as far as qualitative data goes, there could have maybe been qualitative data recorded, maybe like the plant color, were any plants more green than others, were any getting yellow and wilting? That could have also been recorded as well.